Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm here for my Friday reads as usual. I read 2 books this week and I'm going to start with the Louisa May Alcott read. So I read Old Fashioned Girl, which is one of Alcott's books written for children, I guess I'm going to say, more likely for young girls of a certain age. Perhaps, between 10 and 15, I would suggest, because this is definitely a novel. It's not for young children, but it's definitely geared towards a younger audience. And it could definitely be read by, young women as well. I'm sure it was at the time, but it is geared towards, I guess I would say, teenage girls. So this was published in 1870 originally. I have an 1890 printing from Roberts Brothers, which was Alcott's publisher, I think, because, well, at the very least, they republished a lot of her works and had the rights to her works in the 1870s into the 1890s, because I spotted a lot of these editions online. So Old Fashioned Girl is the story of Polly. We get 2 sections of her life. The first part of her life is the first half of this book, and she is going to visit wealthy friends of the family. Her mother knows this wealthy family living in the city, and so off she goes as a little girl to spend a few weeks with them. She spends about 6 weeks with this family. And while she's there, she meets this little boy, Tom, and she becomes quite good friends with Tom, learns to love and respect him in a childlike way, like a brother. While she's there, she also spends a lot of time with Fanny, who is her age, and with Maud, who is quite young at this point. She's a little girl, I think 4 or 5. Now, Fanny, who is 15 or 16 when the novel opens, is quite the little young lady. She's all grown up. She's dressed as a woman, going to fashionable parties, to fashionable places, and behaving like a grown-up, whereas Polly is still very much a little girl, and her parents have raised her in such a way that she understands the value of hard work, of plain clothing, of being kind and never telling a lie, of being modest and moral. And so Polly embodies, the old-fashioned, good young woman, whereas Fanny is more modern, a little bit wild, and as the story seems to hint, perhaps a little bit immodest and immoral. Not too much though. It's, implied that she has been spoiled by poor parenting and wealth. And then we have the second part of the novel where Polly, all grown up, arrives back in the city to take her own room where she's going to be a music teacher because she has a beautiful voice, and she comes back in contact with Fanny and Tom and Maud, and they all learn some lessons, and it all ends with matrimony for everybody in sight. And at face value, it's a very, very sweet novel, and it's very moralistic. Alcott as the narrator, she often in her novels takes on this role as the narrator. Alcott as the narrator, says there could be some lessons to be learned here, and that for the most part, Polly is the girl, the woman that you want to embody as the reader. And Fanny is the one who needs to improve herself, and self-improvement is a major theme in this novel, as in a lot of Alcott's novels that were geared towards a younger audience. But there is an additional layer to it. I shared in my Vlogmas video from yesterday a couple of lines where I think Alcott was being quite humorous and sarcastic about matrimony. It's no secret that Louisa May Alcott herself never married and perhaps didn't have the best opinions of marriage. She thought a woman would be happiest as a spinster. And in fact, there is one character, I won't tell you who, but one character who ends this novel as a spinster, and Alcott hints that she is perhaps the happiest of them all. But overall, I greatly enjoyed this novel. Definitely something I would recommend. I enjoyed it as much as Little Women, if not more, because it comes across as more of a narrative than Little Women. Little Women is, especially in the first few chapters, very episodic, whereas this comes across as a complete narrative where you can definitely see that Alcott was developing Polly into adulthood and setting the other characters up to learn a few lessons from Polly. Yeah, so that was a fun read. Then I read a book that I found on Project Gutenberg from 1919. It's called The Haunted Bookshop, and it was written by Christopher Morley. So this is, I'm going to say, a mystery novel. Perhaps it almost read a little bit like it was bordering into that hard-boiled detective territory, but it wasn't that at all. We do have a character in the novel who is almost like a hard-boiled detective, but a poor imitation of one. And the most interesting part about this book is not the mystery itself. So in the opening passage, we're introduced to this peculiar bookshop. And I want to read you, I've got my laptop here, I want to read you a little bit from the opening of this book. So we have Aubrey, who is wandering through Brooklyn when he sees a bookshop, and it's a very peculiar looking bookshop. It's in an old brownstone, multi-story brownstone, but the first and the second floor have been combined, so it's this bookshop with very high ceilings, and it's got a peculiar name. Parnassus at Home, R&H Milfin. Book lovers welcome, the shop is haunted. So Aubrey, who is an advertising man, stumbles down the stairs into this bookshop. Out of curiosity, when he goes in, he announces that, he doesn't announce, but he searches and he finds the owner, and he suggests that he could help him with advertising. The owner of the bookshop isn't really into that. He says the best advertisement for a bookshop are the patrons themselves, the people who read and who have a good experience and who tell their friends about that book lead to more customers. Word of mouth, the same way that a doctor doesn't need to advertise, neither does a bookseller, says the owner of this bookstore. But this passage I want to read here. So Aubrey enters this bookshop, and in front of him he finds a large placard in a frame. This shop is haunted by ghosts of all great literature in hosts. We sell no fakes or trashes. Lovers of books are welcome here. No clerks will babble in your ear. Please smoke, but don't drop ashes. Browse as long as you like. Prices of all books plainly marked. If you want to ask questions, you'll find the proprietor where the tobacco smoke is thickest. We pay cash for books. We have what you want, though you may not know you want it. Malnutrition of the reading faculty is a serious thing. Let us prescribe for you. By R&H Milfin, proprietors. And so Mr. Milfin is the owner of this bookstore, and Aubrey wanders in, meets Mr. Milfin, and strikes up a bit of a friendship. He is brought back by the thought of a lovely young woman. So Mr. Milfin is good friends with a very wealthy gentleman, a very wealthy book collector, and the wealthy book collector proposes that his daughter, Tatiana, will come and work in the shop. He thinks she's been badly finished off at school, taught some vain things about life, and so he wants her to experience what it's like to actually work a job. And also he wants her to be immersed in books and to learn whatever Mr. Miffin can teach her. And so Tatiana comes to live in this brownstone shop with Mr. Miffin and his wife. And she shows up in her limo with her chauffeur, and we almost expect someone very vain, but she is not at all. She is already, although she isn't very knowledgeable, she hasn't read much, she is already in love with books and willing to do this great job. And little does she know that her father is actually paying Mr. Miffin $20 a week to allow her to work there. And Miffin is paying Tatiana $10 a week under the ruse that those are her wages. So Mr. Miffin is getting a fairly good deal out of this. And you can tell that the author here really loves books and the idea of book selling. There's some what I would call philosophical passages where there's this group of booksellers, getting together, and they're having cider and corn cobs. At first I was confused because the author was talking about this get together of these booksellers where they were going to have some corn cobs and cider. And I was like, what on earth? Corn cobs? Like actual corn on the cob? And then we get to that scene and I realized corn cob pipes. They were smoking pipes and having cider, which, that's not a term we use today, but I guess when this book was published in 1919, that's something that readers would have recognized. And so we're immersed in this world of the bookshop and in all the literature that Mr. Miffin loves. And it's a beautiful scene, beautiful writing, beautiful musings on books, on bookshops. But something mysterious is going on. A copy of a book has disappeared from the shelf. Now, Mr. Miffin knows his bookshop very well, and so he knows when that book is missing. It disappears, and then it returns, and then it disappears again. There are odd comings and goings at night, and Mr. Aubrey, having taken a fancy to Tatiana after only one meeting, sticks his nose into it and takes on this role as a detective of sorts. This is the part that I didn't quite buy, because Aubrey is an advertising man. He lives for advertising. He lives for writing copy. And yet, all of a sudden, he decides to chase down this mystery. And he doesn't even seem that taken with Tatiana or this whole scene. He finds it interesting, sure, but it's a bit surprising when he suddenly picks up to go chasing after leads and become a detective here to unravel this mystery. But overall, I greatly enjoyed this. It's definitely something I would recommend. You can find it on Project Gutenberg, or there are some recent reprintings available. I actually discovered that this is a sequel to an earlier book that I'm obviously going to have to get and read for myself. But on Amazon, you can get this book by itself for I think about $7 Canadian, or for about 20 Canadian, you can get a combined of the first book and this second book. And the first book is about the same bookseller, only he has a traveling book wagon instead. And I'm not sure, but I would suspect that perhaps in that first book, that is the story of how he meets his wife and how he falls in love with her. But it really is a delightful book, and I'm going to dig through because there's a couple more passages I think I would like to read to you here. So here's a fun line. At one point, someone in this book remarks, "It saddens me to think that I shall have to die with thousands of books unread that would have given me noble and unblemished happiness." So this is definitely a book written by a book lover. Miffin says at one point when describing to Aubrey what he perceives the role of the bookseller to be and why he doesn't need an advertising company. He says, people don't go to a bookseller until some serious mental accident or disease makes them aware of their danger. They come here. For me to advertise would be about as useful as telling people who feel perfectly well that they ought to go to the doctor. Do you know why people are reading more books now than ever before? Because the terrific catastrophe of the war has made them realize that their minds are ill. The world was suffering from all sorts of mental fevers and aches and disorders, and never knew it. Now our mental pangs are only too manifest. We are all reading hungrily, hastily, trying to find out, after the trouble is over, what was the matter with our minds. And then there's another interesting line later here. We often talk about, here on BookTube, what makes a good book, whether something is literary or not, how do we tell? And I think Miffin has some wise words here. He says, between ourselves, there is no such thing abstractly as a good book. A book is only good when it meets some human hunger or refutes some human error. And so this is like my philosophy on books in a single sentence. A book is good if it speaks to us in a certain way. A book is good if it impacts us. So that's just a beautiful line for me to come across here. And then let's see. There was in his bookshop a clipping from a copy of Life magazine. And it's titled, On the Return of a Book Lent to a Friend. Now I'm assuming this is actually from a copy of Life because it does sound familiar, but on the other hand, it could be something that the author completely made up and just said it was from Life magazine. On the Return of a Book Lent to a Friend. I give humble and hearty thanks for the safe return of this book, which having endured the perils of my friend's bookcase and the bookcases of my friend's friends, now returns to me in reasonably good condition. I give humble and hearty thanks that my friend did not see fit to give the book to his infant as a plaything, nor use it as an ashtray for his burning pipe, nor as a teething for his mastiff. When I lent this book, I deemed it lost. I was resigned to the bitterness of the long parting. I never thought to look upon its pages again, but now that my book has come back to me, I rejoice and am exceeding glad. Bring hither the fatted morocco, and let us rebind the volume, and set it on the shelf of honor. For this my book was lent, and it was returned to me again. Presently, therefore, I may return some of the books that I myself have borrowed. So that's quite a funny passage there. The idea that when you give a book, you perceive it to be lost, and then you rejoice, like that story in the Christian Bible about the prodigal son returning. That book is like the prodigal son. You never expected to see it again, and you rejoice at seeing it, and you slaughter that fatted calf. But there's a twist here, because it's quite likely that you yourself have the prodigal son of your friends. You are holding on to their books, and you may or may not return them someday because you've lent that book to a friend of a friend, or you've given it to your child. But I thought that was quite a delightful passage. And there's one more here. Living in a bookshop is like living in a warehouse of explosives. Those shelves are ranked with the most furious combustibles in the world, the brains of men. I can spend a rainy afternoon reading, and my mind works itself up to such a passion and anxiety over mortal problems as almost unmans me. It is terribly nerve-wracking. Surround a man with Carlyle, Emerson, Thoreau, Chesterton, Shaw, Nietzsche, and George Ade. Would you wonder at his getting excited? What would happen to a cat if she had to live in a room tapestried with catnip? She would go crazy. And so this comes in when Miffin is saying, I have to do some things apart from being in my books. I do the dishes, because it takes my mind away from books. I go out into the yard, I go for a walk, because when you're constantly surrounded by the most stimulating things, it can be exhausting and can perhaps make you a little unhinged. So this is overall a delightful book. The plot is decent, but just the musings about books in here are what make this book a joyous read. And I don't use joyous very often, but it really was a delightful read overall. So in terms of what I'm reading, I am currently reading A Gentle Madness, which is sort of an ongoing book about books that I've been dipping into, and I am planning to read some more Alcott. I'm not sure what I'm going to dip into next, but you'll find out in the next coming days with my continued videos. As I've said in the past few days, I am doing Litmus, although perhaps not in the traditional vlog style. I am doing vlogs some days, but other days I'm just continuing on with bookish content. I just thought it would be nice for Vlogmas to sort of up my video output and enjoy this Christmas season with a few extra videos. I hope you're all having a lovely Friday.